Hello and welcome to Through the Bible in 10 Years, my weekly podcast. Now, for some of you, I'm going to frustrate you because I do this from time to time. But I thought that because it's the Christmas season, technically it's Advent, not Christmas yet, but because it's the Christmas season, broadly speaking, I thought we might take this week and next week and divert into Matthew chapters 1 and 2. I've already done Luke 1 and 2 in this series. You can find it on YouTube if you do a search under my page. And you could probably find it on Patreon as well. And Luke, of course, has quite different themes than Matthew does. You may not notice it because we have the Christmas play and we've got wise men and shepherds in the same stage, and so we don't realize that we've actually blurred together two quite different presentations of Jesus' birth, each of which has its own special themes and special emphases. So, for example, in Luke, we get typical Luke themes, an emphasis on the poor, an emphasis on lowly shepherds, an emphasis on women, the exaltation of those who are on the margins of society, the humanity of Jesus. Matthew is quite different. Matthew emphasizes the royal nature of Jesus' birth. We get gold, frankincense, of myrrh. And of course, one of the special themes of the Gospel of Matthew is that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament, or fulfilled readings of the Old Testament find great fullness, sensus plenior, if you would, in the life of Jesus. More on that to come. But we want to go ahead and dive in. If you're watching the video version of this, I have the interlinearbible.org of Matthew 1 up. And I think, why don't we begin with verse 1, shall we? So, verse 1, Matthew 1:1. By the way, I do finish things I start. Sometimes it takes longer than you expect. But if I do not die, I will finish the diversion within the diversion within the diversion that is Through the Bible in 10 years. I've not forgotten that I've not finished Acts yet, and I've not finished Luke yet. But I will return, thus saith the skank, if I live long enough. All right, so let's go ahead and start with verse 1. Matthew 1:1, the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Now, very interesting, the Genesis of Jesus Christ. What does that mean? Is it just referring to chapters 1 and 2, the Genesis of Jesus Christ? That might be a natural way to think of it because Matthew 1 and 2 are in fact the birth story of Jesus. Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 give us the birth story of Jesus. My first instinct is to say that's not a book. It's not a biblos. That is more a part of a book. Now, maybe my sense of what a book is interfering here. But I wonder, my inkling is, and I'm not a Matthew scholar, so I'm just giving you my inkling. My inkling is to think that the whole Gospel of Matthew is in fact the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Because, of course, he lives forever. He is ascended into heaven, right? He is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. And of course, we're talking about the human. I do not believe that the Logos was human before the incarnation, which we read about in the Gospel of John. Of course, Matthew doesn't talk about the pre-existence of Jesus by and large. Simon Gathercole did write a book trying to argue that, but I think it's a stretch. There may be some hints here and there, but I think by and large, Matthew doesn't talk about the pre-existence of Jesus. That's maybe a little bit of an aside. I don't know for sure the answer. My first inkling is to think of the book of the Genesis to refer to all of Matthew. But it could perhaps just refer to chapter 1 or chapters 1 and 2. It's possible. Although I would think that a first verse is just as likely to be an introduction to an entire book. Not crucial to life, perhaps. We believe all the right things, regardless of what the specific thing in the bubble above Matthew's head was for this verse. Son of David, son of Abraham. I would argue that Matthew is the most Jewish gospel. And so it makes perfect sense that Matthew would engage Jesus as the son of David and Jesus is the son of Abraham. Again, when Luke gives his genealogy, he goes all the way back to Adam, which fits with Luke because one of Luke's themes is that the gospel is for the whole world. And so there is a sense of going beyond Israel in the Gospel of Luke, and of course, especially in the book of Acts. As the most Jewish gospel, we would expect Matthew to focus a little bit more on the Jewishness of Jesus. And I do myself think that probably the Gospel of Matthew, and I'll do introduction someday on Matthew, not today. When I get to Matthew, I'll do introduction. But I do suspect that Matthew was written to a Jewish Christian audience, or shall we say Christian Jewish audience, because Christianity and Judaism are not separate religions at this time. This is a Jewish text. It is a Christian Jewish text. I personally think that Matthew was written in the 70s. I do not at all think that Matthew was written before the destruction of Jerusalem. I do not think that Matthew was the first gospel. I believe, as most scholars do, that Mark was the first gospel, and that Matthew built off of Mark and perhaps another source, although I won't get into that in this video or podcast. So if Mark dates to around 70, then Matthew must date after 70. So I believe that Matthew was probably written in the post-destruction of Jerusalem period, where Judaism's trying to figure out who's in charge. And I suspect that the group most in charge are the kind of the heirs of the Pharisees. And so that would explain in part why the Gospel of Matthew is so hard on the Pharisees. Of all the Gospels, Matthew is the hardest on the Pharisees. See chapter 23. And part of that is probably because Christianity is to some extent the little man under the thumb of that kind of post, because everybody else is dead, right? The Sadducees ran the temple, temple's gone, Sadducees are gone. They were paraded through the streets of Rome and put to death, probably. Then the Essenes died in the revolution, so they're gone. Revolutionaries died in the revolution. Zealots, Sicarii, they're all dead. So the Pharisees, and some of them, of course, fought as well, I believe. But perhaps the more pacifistic or fatalistic, shall we say, the more Gamaliel-like of the Pharisees may have survived. They believed God will do what God will do. But it is quite possible that Pharisees are the main competition for Christianity, and no doubt the part in control the most at the time that Matthew was written. Well, so not all of that is important to understanding Matthew 1, but my point is that son of David and son of Abraham are not clues, but perhaps small indicators that the Gospel of Matthew was written primarily for a Christian Jewish audience. Son of David, of course, indicates that Jesus is king. And of course, that is, I believe, the main thrust of the family tree here in Matthew 1. The main point, I think, more than anything else, of Matthew 1 is to indicate that Jesus is qualified. His CV is good enough for him to be a king because he is the son of David. He's also the son of Abraham, which suggests that he is part of Israel, that he's in the people of God, which is also very important. He's not a Gentile. And so with that, we are set up for the genealogy. Now, the genealogy is divided up into 3 groups of 14. I believe, I didn't double check before I did this podcast, but I believe that there may be some names missing, which is not a problem. We have to remember that we don't read Matthew according to what our sensibilities are. We read Matthew according to Jewish exegetical standards. I went through a struggle at one point over verses we'll look at, probably Matthew 2, I believe it is. There were some verses that troubled me when I was in seminary and college from Matthew 2, because I thought, well, Matthew's not doing it right. Well, what actually was not right was what my expectations of Matthew were. There's no problem with Matthew using Jewish exegetical techniques, because God meets us where we're at. God incarnated himself in human flesh, and when Jesus came to earth, he came as a Jew, a Jewish male. And when God inspired Matthew, he met Matthew's community where Matthew's community was, using the exegetical techniques that Matthew's community used. And so there are 3 groups of 14. The purpose of the 14 groups of 14, I think, is widely agreed that it is a bit of what is it, gematria. That is, it is a little hint, because there were not separate symbols for numbers in the ancient world. In fact, that's a rather late invention of humanity after Jesus. Their letters doubled as numbers. And so alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet, was 1, and beta was 2. And so if you take the Hebrew letters for David's name, Hebrew doesn't generally use vowels, so David's name in Hebrew is basically a DVD, Dalet, Vav, Dalet. And if you add it up, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet is 4, and then Vav is Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, 6. So we have 4 for D, 6 for V, and 4 for D. What does it add up to? 14. And so to a Jew who understood gematria, Matthew 1 says, David, David, David. Three groups of 14 generations, and it's a literary way of saying Jesus is the king. David, David, David. Jesus is king, Jesus is king, Jesus is king. So that's something that we might be prone to miss from the genealogy, because we don't know how to read it the way the original Jewish Christian audience would have. So the first group is basically from Abraham to David, beginning with verse 2. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judah and his brothers and sisters. Verse 3. And Judah begat Pharez and Zerah from Tamar, and Pharez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Aram. Okay, so we're beginning to get the parts of the Genesis story that we know. What's interesting here is the first mention of a woman, namely Tamar. There are, I don't remember, 4 or 5 women mentioned in the genealogy, which I think in and of itself is significant, because women generally did not count in that day. And so the very mention of women is very striking. What is also striking is that each of these women has something about them that is a little suspicious or peculiar. And what I mean by that is, if you were to create a squeaky clean genealogy, no black sheep in this family, everybody in our genealogy is good, we're pure bloods, that sort of thing. The women in this genealogy are, or let's say from a human standpoint, some of them might be considered a little bit of an embarrassment in some circles. So Tamar, as you remember, dressed up like a prostitute because Judah was not keeping up his responsibility as her father-in-law to provide her with a husband, because her first husband died and her second husband died, and it was Judah's responsibility to give her the youngest son, but Judah didn't want to. He was afraid she was some kind of a praying mantis, or something, and so a black widow. So he was afraid, and so she dressed up like a prostitute, and he seemed happy enough to avail himself of her services. But then when he got all upset at her, for not being faithful, she produced evidence that he was the father, and he was like, "Oh, you're more righteous than I am." So this is our first woman in the genealogy, and it's a person that from a worldly perspective, you might say, or even from a holier than thou or self-righteous perspective, you might say, what's she doing in this genealogy? And I have wondered if some viewed Mary that way. If some, in Nazareth, if somebody said, yeah, I'm pregnant, but it's from God, it's from the Holy Spirit, the first reaction, I think, of pretty much everybody's going to be, yeah. So Mary probably was looked a little bit askance in Nazareth, I suspect. And Jesus, I don't think Jesus probably, I think he probably suffered from a little name calling and dismissal probably in Nazareth. I don't think he had probably a a delightful childhood in that respect. And so it may very well be that the women in this genealogy are meant to be a warning to anybody who would dismiss Jesus or Mary because she got pregnant with Jesus before she was fully married to Joseph. She was already betrothed to Joseph, but before it was fully done. Well, let's go ahead with verse 4. And Aram begat Aminadab, and Aminadab begat Naasson, and Naasson begat Salmon, verse 5, and Salmon begat Boaz from Rahab. Okay, here's our second woman in the genealogy. Who is Rahab? She was somebody who ran a house of prostitution off the wall of Jericho, and she's not an Israelite. She's a foreigner. And so even though Matthew may be the most Jewish gospel, it should not be lost on us, both that wise men will visit Jesus in chapter 2, and also that the Great Commission is in Matthew 28, which says to go and make disciples of every nation. Matthew may focus on phase 1, Jesus being Jewish, but Matthew, to make no mistake, Matthew also clearly indicates that the gospel is for all people. And so Rahab here is a hint of that. Again, a woman who you might say, oh, don't mention her, but she is fully incorporated, a foreigner, imagine that. An immigrant is mentioned positively in the genealogy of Jesus. Let's continue, verse 5 continued. And then Boaz begat Obed from Ruth. Oh, here's another foreigner. Our third woman in the genealogy is a Moabite woman, Ruth. And although Ruth is clearly virtuous, completely and utterly virtuous in the Old Testament, there were no doubt many within Israel who would have said, no Moabites have any place in the genealogy of the Messiah. Well, think again, because of course Ruth is either the grandmother or great-grandmother of David. Continuing on with verse 5. And Obed begat Jesse, verse 6, and Jesse begat David the king. All right. So there we have our first, 14 generations so far from Abraham to David. Continuing on then with verse 6. And David begat Solomon from the wife of Uriah. It doesn't mention Bathsheba. Why? It mentions the foreigner. Again, isn't that interesting? Doesn't say from Bathsheba, who I believe was an Israelite, but mentions the man who is a Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. I'm getting a point here. God is okay with people who aren't Israelites. The gospel's for everybody. And again, although this is not an emphasis of Matthew, it is an emphasis of this genealogy. And it's a clear point to take away from the gospel of Matthew. God is okay with people who aren't Israelites, people who are foreigners. God, if they have faith, God will incorporate them. Verse 7. And Solomon begot Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begat Abijah, and Abijah begat Asa. Verse 8. And Asa begat Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat begat Joram, and Joram begat Uzziah. Verse 9. And Uzziah begat Jotham, and Jotham begat Ahaz, and Ahaz begat Hezekiah. Verse 10. Hezekiah begat Manasseh, and Manasseh begat Amos, and Amos begat Josiah. Verse 11. And Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brothers at the carrying away to Babylon. So there's our second group of 14 generations. Verse 12. And after the carrying away of Babylon, Jeconiah begat Salathiel, and Salathiel begat Zerubbabel. Of course, Zerubbabel is where they came back from Babylon. Zerubbabel begat Abiud, and Abiud begat Eliakim, and Eliakim begat Azor. Azor begat Zadok, Zadok begat Akim, Akim begat Eliud. Verse 15, Eliud begat Eleazar, and Eleazar begat Mathan, and Mathan begat Jacob. Verse 16, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, the one being called Messiah, the one being called Christ. And of course, Christ is the Greek for anointed one. in Hebrew, Mashiach, from which we get the word Messiah. Anointed because, of course, this was part of the ceremony of being installed as a king, is you have oil poured over your head. You are anointed with oil. Matthew's genealogy is a little different from Luke's genealogy. The classic suggestion is that perhaps Luke follows Mary's genealogy more and Matthew more Joseph's genealogy. This is a very male-centric genealogy, although it does, again, strikingly include women. And I do think when you get to Mary, I suspect part of the takeaway is don't dismiss Mary or Jesus because they're not the normal kind of squeaky clean, what you would expect kind of thing. Well, we finish then with verse 17, the end of the genealogy. Verse 17, therefore all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the carrying away of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the carrying away of Babylon unto the Christ, the Messiah, 14 generations. And I've already talked about the likely meaning of that as saying, David, 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 Jesus is king, Jesus is king, Jesus is king. All right, verse 18. So when we get to verse 18, we now have the birth story of Jesus. Of course, Luke gives us a lot of backstory with Elizabeth and Mary and so forth. Matthew is much shorter and to the point. Of course, I personally think that Luke was written after Matthew, probably in the 80s. And so the Gospel of Matthew does not have Luke at all in mind, I don't think, when it writes this. I'm quite open to the possibility that Luke knew Matthew by contrast. Well, okay, let's go in with verse 18 here. Now, the genesis of Jesus Christ was thus. Now, this is the same word in verse 1, so you might argue, see, it's just talking about chapters 1 and 2, maybe. Again, see a commentary, somebody who's actually put more research into it. I've done research on Matthew, of course, over the years, but not the kind you would put in if you were to do a commentary. Now, the genesis of Jesus Christ was thus. His mother Mary being pledged or betrothed to Joseph. Now, this often happened, of course, while Mary was a little girl, she may have been betrothed to Joseph. Who knows? The parents could have made an arrangement before either of them was even born, where the parent number one says, hey, if you have a girl and I have a guy, or vice versa, let's get them married. These things could be arranged years in advance. And so it may very well be that Mary was too young for Joseph, actually, to take her as a wife. I mean, I picture Mary, again, I can't prove it. Mary could be 14. She could be very young. Joseph could be in his late 20s or even 30s. He may have had another wife. Who knows? Maybe not. But let's just guess that he might be in his 20s and that she might be in her early teens. Who knows? Or who knows? Maybe it's only 5 or 6 years. Maybe he's 18 or 19 and she's 13 or 14. I don't know. We don't know these things. And no amount of speculation or, well, I'm going to go find a commentary that tells me that. We just don't know. We don't have enough information. Sometimes we just have to say we don't have enough information. But so Mary, his mother, being pledged to Joseph, before they came together, she was found having in the womb. She was found having in the engastri. She was found pregnant, basically, from the Holy Spirit. Again, Matthew's very careful. She's not pregnant because she has slept with anybody or anything like that. She's not been raped by a Roman soldier, which I think Hitler thought something like that, if I remember correctly. Nothing like that. She is pregnant of the Holy Spirit. Verse 19, and Joseph, her husband, being righteous and not being willing to disgrace her, he decided secretly to put her away. So he thought, well, I don't want to embarrass her. I don't want to shame her. I'm just going to secretly talk to her parents or I don't know, I'm going to secretly divorce her. I'm going to secretly put her away. Verse 20, and while he was pondering these things, behold, an angel of the Lord in a dream appeared to him. Interesting that we have angels appear to the shepherds in Luke while they're awake, but in Matthew, he appears to Joseph in a dream, which, of course, their dreams in the Old Testament are one way that God speaks to people. So the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, he's a son of David, got that lineage bit in there. Joseph, son of David, do not fear to receive Mary as your wife, for that which has been begotten in her is from the Holy Spirit. So Joseph is now counseled clearly by the Lord. It's Gabriel in Luke. I don't know whether it says Gabriel here, so we shouldn't assume that this is Gabriel. It is the angel of the Lord. There are many angels of the Lord. Of course, in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord is possibly a Christophany. At least some people have suggested that. But anyway, let's keep going here. She will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he himself will save his people from their sins. Now, of course, Jesus is English. In Greek, it's Jesus. And in Hebrew, it's Joshua, Yeshua, right? So there's an overtone of Joshua here. I always was puzzled by the King James of Hebrews 4, because it said, in the King James, it says, if Jesus had saved them, they wouldn't have spoken of another day. And I thought, well, Jesus did save us. But all modern translations translate it as Joshua, because that's who it's talking about. Joshua brought Israel into the land of Canaan, of course, and Jesus, Yeshua means Yahweh saves. And so there's a meaning to his name, Jesus. He will save his people from their sins. You will call his name Jesus. Verse 22, and all of this happened that it might fulfill that which is spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, and this is one of the themes that we see in Matthew, especially in the birth stories, but we see it quite frequently in Matthew, and that is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. I'm going to talk in a second about how we shouldn't think of fulfillment so much in terms of straightforward prediction fulfillment. It's more of filling up the meaning of the Old Testament words with a meaning that relates to Jesus. But let's go ahead here. This happened that it might be fulfilled that which was spoken by the Lord through the prophets, saying, behold, verse 23, behold, the virgin will have in stomach, the virgin will become pregnant and will bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which is being interpreted, God with us. This is, of course, Isaiah 7:14. Now, when I say a fuller sense, what I mean is Isaiah 7:14 had a meaning in Isaiah. It was a sign to a king Ahaz about two kings to the north, the king of Syria and the king of Israel. Isaiah comes to Ahaz and says, don't worry about the kings to the north. God's going to take care of them. You don't have to go down to Egypt and make an alliance with those people, because the Lord will take care of it. Just ask him for a sign. And Ahaz is like, I don't want to ask the Lord for a sign. I can see Egypt. I can't see the Lord, so la, 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 I'm not listening, and then Isaiah gets a little frustrated. He says, okay, fine. The Lord himself will give you a sign. A young woman is going to conceive and give birth to a son, and before the son is old enough to tell the difference between right and wrong, God will have brought Assyria to destroy the kings to the north. Now, these words, I think, God kind of nudged Gabriel and said, watch this. Isaiah doesn't know, but this is also about Jesus in about 700 years. But there was a first meaning too, because of course, if it was only about Jesus, then it wasn't a very good sign to Ahaz, right? Something that was fulfilled 700 years later, that's no sign to Ahaz. It's very difficult for us to read that verse in its original context, because we immediately go to Jesus, which is a fuller sense, a sensus plenior, a fuller meaning to the words than they had maybe originally in Isaiah's day. A virgin conceives A virgin can conceive if she gets pregnant the first time that she has sex. So it is possible for the verse to be about some child born at the time of Ahaz. And so that child is a sign, because before that child has matured, Assyria had come and gotten rid of the northern kingdom, unfortunately. So this prophecy, interestingly enough, must have been made somewhere around 730 BC, 725 BC, somewhere. We can actually locate the prophecy in Isaiah 7 to, I'm guessing about a 10-year window, because the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria in 722 BC. But there is a fuller sense here. There's a fuller sense, a spiritual meaning, if you would. The Lord helps Matthew to see a meaning in Isaiah 7:14 that he hasn't seen before. That the virgin birth of Jesus is a fulfillment, a spiritual fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14. Verse 24. So this is the promise that God gives to Joseph in this dream. Verse 24. And Joseph, having arisen from the sleep, he did what the angel commanded. The angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took his wife. He received his wife. Verse 25. And he did not know her, which of course is the biblical term for euphemism for sex. He did not have sex with her. I think the implication is that he did go on to have other children with her afterwards. I apologize for any Roman Catholics who might be listening to me. That's just the most natural way to take the biblical text. Verse 25, he did not know her until she had borne a son, and he called his name Jesus. Joseph comes off here as a very good man, right? He believes, first of all, he believes the dream. He believes the angel of the Lord, and he does it, and he treats Mary as a person with honor. Well, there you have it. Matthew chapter 1 in this Advent season, as we approach the time of Christmas. And I hope that you will have a blessed Christmas by the time I do Matthew 2 next Sunday, Lord willing. We will already be past the Christmas event. And so I wish you a blessed Christmas, and may you remember that Jesus came to save us from our sins, and that in fact Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. This has been Through the Bible in 10 years.